This is a panel on education. This is paramount. And the one thing that I think we forget in relationship to education, and I'll have more about this to say about it later, is that we make certain educational assumptions that has no basis in fact. And there are certain educational realities we do not look at. Powerful people never educate you in how to take their power away from them. So to be educated in this society, to be truly educated, is a contradiction in terms. Education has but one honorable purpose, and one alone. Everything else is a waste of time. And that is to prepare you to be a proper handler of power. If nothing else, power over yourself. When you teach a child the meaning of a stoplight, and when the child can go without your assistance across streets and get back home safely, you have given the child power, the power of knowing when to stop and when to start. So all information is a form of education. If you're wise enough, it becomes a form of knowledge. And if you're wiser still, it becomes a form of wisdom. Now, I'm not going to get into long introductions because I want the speakers to have a maximum of time. Only two speakers are here right now. The first speaker is Professor Donna Richards. She's from my department at Hunter College. The gentleman sitting next to her is Professor Amos Wilson from DeHostis College. Now, originally, she was supposed to go to DeHostis, but we grabbed her for Hunter because we assumed, and rightly so, that was where she would have the greatest amount of development and the greatest amount of support. And she got it. Now, Dr. Richards and I met at the crossroads of both of our lives. I hadn't been married long the second time, and she was active in the civil rights movement. And she came because she was younger and bolder and badder then. She and a group came into my office at How You Act and literally told me what they needed from me and what they needed from other activists, scholar activists. So Tina Harris developed a paper called Black Consciousness. And that was the basis of some conferences we had in New Orleans. We continued that with Roots Day outside of Selma. That Black Conscious paper and the information that came out of these two conferences was observed by a young activist named Stokely Carmichael. And the ideas became the basis for the Black Power concept. We who were in on the embryo, the child of Black Power, have not talked about it, and the real story of the origin and development of Black Power hasn't been known, is not known anyway. But my greatest interest in Professor Richards is her writing and her ability to explore neglected aspects of racism and racial thought. I think once her PhD thesis on the subject is ever published, and it may never be published because of, it surely won't be published in its present form because I don't think the white press can take it. I don't think the black press is able to, ready to deal with it. First, it's too big, and it is financially more than they can handle right now. It will be one of the best books dealing with new insight into racism, if it ever saw the light. And part of it has seen the light in a number of articles. But Professor Richards' time is limited this evening, and she might have to leave for the question and answer period. But we're going to bring her on right now. She is a friend and kind of a protege, but she's one of those young scholars that I look to pave the way and be here, opening up new ideas when sleep comes down to soothe my weary eyes.
Hotep. Thank you, Professor Clarke. I want to talk very, very briefly about theories of learning and education in African civilization in terms of the African worldview, African culture, and African philosophy, and perhaps touch on some practical implications of those theories. Education, it has been said, and certainly this comes from the African worldview, is a process of personal transformation. And this process of personal transformation, I believe, is a very important concept that we get in Dr. Molefi Asante's Afrocentricity, where he talks about the transcendental process. In terms of Africa, education was continual, and it was integrated into other aspects of life. That is, it is a holistic process. And as one went through this process, as one goes through this process, one is further integrated into the various parts of the culture. In terms of the African worldview, the theory of knowledge, or we could say the epistemology, which underlies the system, is one in which ultimate truth is seen to be intuitive, where it is dependent on your total development as a person, on your spiritual development as well as your physical development, which involves your intellectual development. And I'd like to make a distinction here, which I think would be helpful, and that is between esoteric knowledge and exoteric knowledge or learning. The esoteric would be the hidden, the sacred, where the exoteric is the public. In terms of the African worldview, the esoteric is definitely the base for everything that we do, the sacred and the spiritual. The Dogon people in Mali talk about actually 5 levels of learning. Jerry So, which is the word at face value. Beni So, the word from the side. Bolo So, the word from behind. And So Dei, the clear word. These would be part of a process preparing the person to then receive sacred knowledge. And sacred knowledge for them involved the purpose of human existence and the nature of creation. And I think that if we think about this, we can use this as a model for formulating a philosophy of education in which we see stages of gaining sight, which would be the first level, Jeriso, then perspective, Beniso, penetration, Boloso, and vision, Sodei, so that we could then gain understanding and wisdom. And this would be a process of intellectual and spiritual development. Learning in Africa always takes place in stages. And one learns something when one is ready to learn that. And I think that what we can learn from this is that immediately we can begin to put in place initiation procedures which would involve very serious learning for our young people, which would involve their intellectual growth, but at the same time their cultural and, importantly, their political growth, and be based on spiritual development. We can put these initiation processes immediately into working. That's something that we can do. We don't need a lot of money to do that. We certainly do not need European institutions to do that. And it can be a way in which we can gain control of what our children learn. And all we have to do is to look at African civilization in order to get a model for how that can be done. Now, another very important part of this process, which is understood in African civilization, is the development and use of what we would call icons or sacred symbols, which have the ability to touch the consciousness of people at a very, very deep kind of level, so that our children will begin to recognize and identify with those icons or those sacred symbols. That's a part of learning. And part of the problem that we are having now as a people is that we have been conditioned with European icons, so that they are affecting our consciousness without us realizing that. And that's one of the things that happens as we watch videos and partake of the media, is that we see one thing on a conscious level on the screen, but there's a whole nother thing that's going on there that's affecting our consciousness, which affects our learning, which inhibits our personal transformation, or rather enables there to be a development of the kind of person they want us to be, which is what Professor Clarke was talking about before. They certainly do not want us to be the people who will be able to take power from them. So what I'm saying is that as we establish these processes of initiation as a process of education, we have got to consciously develop icons that our children can identify with and learn through. Malcolm X is an icon for us. The Ankh is an icon for us. That is, it is an image which embodies concepts and ideas and identity with a particular heritage and history. This involves a system of examination, a system of ordeals. We keep check on spiritual development as one goes through this process. This is what we see in African civilization. Another part of this should be, one of the things that Dr. Alexander talked about was Diop's critique of the monopoly of knowledge by the elders. And what Diop says is that if they just hold on to all of this knowledge, then when they become older, then it can pass with them, and it has not been passed on. But the system of apprenticeship, of tutors, of mentoring, that is, having a close relationship with a younger person who seriously is committed to relationships, which okay. Oh, that's full. Okay. We have to understand the issues of power, as well as the uses of technology. Now, what we can do and what we must do is to redefine what technology means. We have to define these concepts for ourselves. For instance, we can define technology as the tools of Afrocentric development, put at the service of Pan-African self-determination. We have to develop an African psychology that is to look at how the minds of our children work so that we can best teach them and work with them, teach them how to think critically, how to ask questions, how to analyze. Educational and training institutions and programs can be set up immediately by us, which teach our children practical skills. And then, of course, we need economic programs so that we can have buildings in which to house these institutions, so that we can have conferences in our own major buildings that we have for that. There are so many lectures and lecture series, wonderful ones, that are given throughout this city. I don't know how it is for you who come from other cities. But we don't have our own buildings in which those lectures take place. And there are enough of us to get together and have a building. Okay? One of the things that we can all do in terms of education is that we can immediately begin organizing after-school programs. Organizing schools is something that we need to do. That takes more time, takes more resources. After-school programs can build towards those, and we can do them immediately, right now, when people leave this room. All you have to do is to get together with maybe 3 or 4 other people who share your commitments and have children. Get those children together, and you begin developing a program. That's what we did, and we've had a program now, it's going into its 3rd year. And I would simply like it to be a model for others so that other people can see that it's very easy to do. All it takes is commitment. And then through all of this, we need to develop some standardized curricula material that can be dispersed throughout the African community in this nation and throughout the world. And there, again, are enough of us doing this kind of work that we can think in terms of standardizing things and getting them in record form. Finally, we need to pull these 2 aspects together, the practical and the spiritual, the esoteric and the exoteric. Both are extremely important. But we cannot have one without the other. The esoteric, spiritual, and the holistic must go hand in hand with the exoteric, the practical, and what has been called the academic in European culture. For us, the base will always have to be the sacred, will always have to be the spiritual, because it is from there that we get meaning and that we get our commitments to and our values, and it is from there that we get our direction. So this is something that I think we can both learn from African civilization and that we can just use and begin to build. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a pleasure to be invited to sort of speak with you today. I won't, again, take up much of your time. I won't pretend to be an expert on Egyptian education and Nile Valley education, since my interest is more contemporary. So I'll just sort of briefly outline some of the information I've been able to glean about the education of the Egyptian boy in particular. One of the things, though, that I found out about Egyptian education is the fact that certainly education was highly revered among the Egyptians, and the learned person was a highly revered and respected individual. Learning then had a major place, a central place in Egyptian life. So where and whenever you come upon Egyptian literature, you find an enthusiastic reverence for learning. And many of the journals and diaries of various persons during this period of time referred to education. One such as a nobleman who was carrying his son to a school on the Nile, who admonished him to give thy heart to learning and love her like a mother, for there is nothing that is so precious as learning. When we look at Egyptian education, we see that the education began very early in the life of children. The boys began their education at around age 4. And that education continued for about 10 to 12 years. So essentially you had what we would consider today an adolescent at age 14, 15, and 16, ready to enter into full adult life and to undertake adult responsibilities in terms of his past learning. The arts of reading and writing and knowledge of books was recognized by all classes of Egyptians. And as we might expect, the king's children and the children of the official classes were educated at the court schools, even though education also took place at the temples. And at a later point in Egyptian life, they took place at under various governmental agencies and departments. Because, of course, we must recognize that Egyptian society was a very complex one, and therefore education took place in many areas of Egyptian life, some of it being more specified than others. The high officials of the government were in part responsible for the education of the youngsters, as well as, of course, the priests and others we would expect to be involved in education. You had a type of corporate education as well, where the young man was educated by an official who ran a particular department, but also was a worker for that official. So you got sort of a double type of education, a type of cooperative education, where the student learned the formal curriculum, but also learned by doing. It was involved in the practical workings of the system and of the department under which he was being educated. The education also took place under what we call the schoolmaster. And this education was very strict and severe. In fact, it's a type of education that many of us have come to repudiate to a certain degree, because corporal punishment was not forbidden and was used quite liberally. The student sat at the master's feet, and the schoolmaster had what we call today virtually absolute power and authority when dealing with the student. The student began school very early in the morning and worked until noonday or for long hours. The penalty for not paying attention, the penalties for being lazy were quite severe. And you can, in looking at some of the proverbs, you can recognize that many of these schoolmasters did not hesitate to execute discipline. One of the standard statements was, "A boy's ears are in his backside, and he listens or obeys when he is beaten." But of course, another major part of the disciplining of the boy was not merely that of corporal punishment, but that of what we call admonishments, proverbs, where the student was constantly admonished with proverbs and sayings to, of course, do his best, to strive for excellence. And so in the review of various schools' materials, you will see those materials filled with proverb after proverb, warning after warning, and other kinds of statements seeking to motivate the student highly to achieve perfection. Education was not something merely given to the noble people or the sons of noble people, but also people of what we may call the lower classes, many of whom went to school with the sons of princes. So there was a mixing of classes, particularly in the school for scribes. So then we can see an interest in the basic elements of education, reading, writing, and so forth, going down not only in terms of the noble classes, but in terms of the working classes themselves. In terms of what was learned, we pretty much see in general outline that what was learned during the educational period of the Egyptian boy was pretty much what's being learned today: reading, writing, and arithmetic to a good extent. A great deal of emphasis was put on the learning of the hieroglyphics, and a great deal of emphasis was put on copying materials, copying from books, and of course copying the proverbs and saying of elders and revered ancients. A good deal of emphasis was put on, of course, words and vocabulary. The attitudes of the boys were stimulated as well, particularly in terms of being industrious and active. Much of the material that the student copied was material from his own schoolmaster, and much of that material was material that was written into form of advice, in forms of rebukes and exhortations to work toward excellence and to work with all their might. There was a very high reverence for words among the Egyptians, and of course the student was taught to revere words. In fact, the words were often referred to as divine words. The words were seen as the invention of the god Thoth, who was very much the patron god of writing, period. This revering of the word, of course, we see present in African cultures after Egypt, right on down to the present day. I was sort of impressed to see reference made to the word in Mantu, as I believe it was John who talked about the word and its importance to African culture and society. All magic, he states, is word magic, incantation and exorcism, blessing and curse. Through nomo, that is the word, man establishes his mastery over things. Everything comes into being through the word. And of course, we are reminded of this in the familiar testament that reads, "First there was the word, and the word was with God, and the Word was God. And of course, we're reminded of the creation story, which sees creation taking place in terms of the Word. This idea then of the Word as a creative force, as a transforming force, has been a part of African culture up to the present day. The Word, John says, itself is force. The Word holds the course of things and changes and transforms them. No more, the Word creates images upon images and transforms them. In what I think is a very remarkable book, The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, we see again Paulo Freire talking about the Word, in one instance stating, to speak a true word is to transform the world. And of course, we see in the teachings of Jesus the statement again about words and about truth. And the truth being that which frees men from bondage. Freire says to exist humanly is to name the world, to change the world. Beside the study of words, of course, was the study of math, the study of geometry, because, of course, as we're all familiar with, this was very necessary for the building of Egyptian society, for the measuring of land, and various other types of activities that were very necessary to the functioning of Egyptian society. Let's look for a moment briefly at what this education was used for. I don't want to leave you with the impression, of course, that Egyptian education was narrow. It was quite broad. That education included even gymnastics, and of course the teaching of ethics, and Professor Richards has alluded to the fact that the idea of spirit, the idea of ethics and conducts is at the very center of African education, and we see that at the very center of Egyptian education. Practical philosophy was also a part of the education of the Egyptian child. That is, philosophy not just in its abstract sense, but philosophy in terms of conducting oneself. The Egyptians, of course, held in high esteem the ability of the individual to behave mannerably, to behave justly. And this was considered then just as much a part of education as an education in hieroglyphics and other aspects of language and literature, as well as mathematics. Good manners and conduct was a major part of education. Of course, you had the education of the soldiers, the education of the painters, of the sculptors, the various other craftsmen, and the various other professions as well. The education of the Egyptian was used pretty much, in a sense, the way education is used today, to carry out very functional jobs and activities in the society itself. Of course, the kings and nobles and the elite classes owned very large tracts of land, and they had chronic need for scribes, for people who could mathematically register their crops, who could perform the necessary mental, academic, and other kinds of work to see that the harvest and other activities were performed efficiently. The priesthood class was also a class of very large landowners and required large numbers of scribes and other scholars as well. Scribes to keep the accounts of things going on in the temple, to copy the religious texts, of course, because now, of course, it amazes me today when I look at how we use copiers, and you begin to think, how is it that people made it without these things we call copiers today? And you recognize that there had to be an awful lot of writing and copying in order for knowledge to be disseminated. So consequently, of course, the work for the scribes was plentiful in the copying of text and, of course, writing for people, translating for people. in keeping the registers of religious offerings to the gods, for drafting inscriptions on the temples which were to be painted. So a great deal was to be accomplished by education. And of course, in terms of sculpting, in terms of painting, in terms of building, architecture, engineering, and all of the things we admired the Egyptian society for, had to be, of course, supported by an educational system. The education of the scribe was, of course, highly valued, probably above all others, or at least equal to many other levels and forms of education. It had some very practical aspects to it. Some of the practical aspects, of course, are the kind of aspects we see today. To become a scribe was to move into a whole new class, was to gain immense status, was also to move into an area of employment in which there was little or no unemployment. It was a chance to be employed by the kings and queens and nobles and whatever other groups were responsible for the functioning of the society as a whole. It gave a man a chance perhaps to lead the armies, to become a diplomat, an ambassador, to be a special envoy of the king, maybe to be a major potentate within the king's court. It meant that he was highly respected by others and carried a great deal of authority. So you can see why many Egyptians, both so-called lower class as well as higher class, aspired to getting their sons to follow this profession. I want to look for a moment then at possibly what we can learn from the study of Egyptian education. As we already have seen, there are some parallels in Egyptian education with education as it's carried out today, and there are some things about Egyptian education which we need to revive. Certainly the love for knowledge is something that we find in Egyptian education that can be stimulated far more than it is today. I'm constantly surprised sometimes in my classes when I become ecstatic about learning, and how sometimes my students are looking at me as if I'm freaking out. And in fact, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, the New York Times had an article that related concentration to euphoria. And the idea being that learning at times can be a euphoric experience. In fact, I've often compared it to a climactic experience, something which has somewhat of a sexual nature about it. You see this kind of ecstasy in learning in children very early in life. Because, ladies and gentlemen, ultimately the human being adjusts to his or her culture through learning. The brain itself is a learning machine. It comes to the world not organized like that of an animal and not pre-wired like that of instinctual beings, but it comes made programmable so that it can aid in the adaptation of the human being to various environments and various cultures and various situations. It is an instrument, the brain is, that is designed to, after it gets certain information, to coordinate that information and to perform creative acts on that information, and therefore influence its environment and adapt the environment to its own needs. Generally then, what we have, we can say then that learning, of course, obviously is a necessary human activity. And generally those necessary human activities, those activities that are necessary for sustaining the life and the survival of human beings, are often attended with pleasure in their functioning. You could imagine what would happen to us if sex was painful. So in the service of life, sex is indeed a very pleasurable activity. In the service of survival, then, learning too should be indeed an ecstatic and pleasurable activity. And we see that in children as they dot and dash through the environment early in life, and they are so curious, and they are exploring and investigating, and they are startled and awed by the various things that the environment have to offer. And it is somewhat pathetic, though, to see as they move into their later years of childhood, they begin to associate learning with anxiety, with fear. And later on, you can see them even beginning to wear dumbness and stupidness as a badge of honor. When they gain status from their peers by demonstrating their ignorance. So you know then, for learning to be unpleasurable, there must have been at some point during the life of the human being when it was twisted and distorted by misguided adults and others who influenced the child. Hopefully then we can resurrect this love of learning among ourselves. The love of words, which was, as I stated, very high among the Egyptians, I certainly hope will be restored to us today as Africans. As we said earlier, first there was the Word, and the Word was God, the Word was with God, and we see God creating the world in terms of the Word and the image and the symbol. We are in this building today, and we must know that the first act of the creation of this building was the bringing forth of an image in somebody's mind, a thought, an idea, followed again by a whole set of words and negotiations, and again by a whole set of figures and symbols on paper. And then it was out of this use of words and symbols that we have this organized structure that we're in today. No buildings that we see are the result of random activity. They are the result of the use of the word and of imaging. And for a people to build and construct and to transform the world and to transform the society, for a people to transform themselves, they must have the word. One of the major problems with the African today is that he has no control of the word. We are complaining today about the fact that the word has been put into the hands of another people. And those words being put into the hands of another people have been used to destroy our self-image, our self-confidence, have been used to destroy our mind, have been used as vehicle in which to introject the inferiority complex into our very personalities today. We will not gain control of ourselves nor control of the world until we gain control of the word and the control of the image. The word is divine, the word is magic, and we will not be able to perform that magic until the word becomes ours again. One of the major functions of the black professional is to gain control of the word and to gain control of definition. One of the things that I've noted as being one of the constants that has remained with us since we've dealt with the European, no matter how many changes we've gone through, no matter what you say about integrated living and all of this other stuff we call progress today, is that the European has not relinquished his control of the word and has not relinquished his control of information. The control of information is the first step that one must achieve when one wants to brainwash another and wants to create the mind of another. The words that a parent says to a child helps to create the personality of that child. The absence of words also create personality as well. And consequently, when we talk about education today, both with this presence of words and this negative words and with this absence of positive words, we see then in this control of words, the control of the African mind. Of course, the other thing we can note in terms of Egyptian education is the emphasis on discipline. Maybe we would have some problems with corporal punishment as a form of discipline. However, the idea that there must exist some discipline is one that we must endorse. When I go to schools, the first thing I'm struck with as I visit schools, particularly in the city of New York, is the absence of discipline, is a sense of disorder and a sense of chaos. Even when I enter into the classroom of teachers, I still get this sense. We as Africans will have to study the relationship between discipline and learning. I think we've been put into a major trick. It's interesting to note that the Europeans literally beat their children into the middle class. And then once they beat them into the middle class and created a tradition around them, corporal punishment became unlawful. And now it is scientific to approach them in various other ways. However, we as a people must recognize that in terms of our own development, we do not occupy the exact historical situation, economic and social situation of the European. And consequently, their methods for disciplining their children may not be appropriate to the methods we may need to use in order to move our own people forward. We must not be then deceived by these people who choose to ignore their history and to present now their methods of disciplining their children as being scientific, as being the latest in psychological research and discovery. We must recognize them for what they are. They represent a historical process of a people now who have gone through an evolutionary phase in the educating of their children to the point now where other methods of disciplining and control may be used. Therefore, we have to look at the disciplining of our children in terms of the reality of the African in the world today and in terms of what we are trying to achieve. Professor Richardson mentioned apprenticeship, which we see, of course, plenty of in the Egyptian educational system. And coincidentally, for the last couple of days, I've also been thinking along those lines of the need for more of us as professionals to take under our wings protégés and others and to see to their training and development, because we cannot leave the whole of the training of our scholars, of our intellectuals, and of other people and of others to the European. Obviously, as Dr. Clarke has indicated, the European is not going to move us toward liberation education. In European education, in Egyptian education, we see a reverence for history. We, of course, have mentioned a reverence for ethics and for spirit. This is very, very, very important. I think this is one of the key things that will distinguish an Afrocentric education from that of a Eurocentric education. That is the including into the education of a spiritual component, of an ethical component. As I've said on many occasions, the educated individual today is the most dangerous individual on earth. Educated human beings today, ladies and gentlemen, are twisted and distorted, and they represent the greatest danger to life on earth. How do I say that? When this world ends, and if it ends, it will not be brought to an end by muggers, by rapists, by robbers, by dropouts. It will be brought to an end by PhDs. It will be brought to an end by people who have clipped lawns and little lovely kids and two-car garages. It will be brought to an end by the pillars of society, who go to church, who vote, who are concerned with the Board of Education, but who will also go to work and design bombs and design all kinds of offensive and defensive weapons, doctors who will design germ warfare, botanists who will design biological warfare to destroy crops, psychologists who will design methods of destroying people's minds and so forth, sociologists who will determine how you can destroy a society and its values. So the thing that we must recognize, that education in a Eurocentric society is an education for war. And every discipline is a part of that war effort. Every discipline is a part of its scheme to dominate other people. The African-American student is often deceived by this type of thing. They're deceived into thinking that the education they're receiving is non-political, which is the most political thing of all. All disciplines are related in some way to politics, and all disciplines are in some way related to maintaining the dominance of Eurocentric society. The Eurocentric society is one that is based on death and domination. And those people who are educated in it are educated to bring death and domination upon other people. Therefore, the educated individual who feels he's educated and his education gives him a right to rob and steal from the average man and the lesser educated man, and he thinks by spending 10 or 20 years in school, he's justified in robbing the people of every last dime they have. And so therefore you can see even our medical doctors and so forth often then have in them still that germ of rape and robbery that is a part of Eurocentric education. The education is very subtle. I told my class the other day, wouldn't it really be so different if you came to this class out of a desire to learn, just out of the pure desire to learn, and that we didn't relate to each other as student and teacher, but as people sharing knowledge and information. And that I don't have to take the role of an authority over you. And that I don't have to motivate your education through fear, so that you do what you are asked to do because you're afraid of getting an F, or because you want to get an A, or because you want to be great one day, or because you want status and all of these other things. Can't you see then at the very center of your education is an education based on fear and false pride and false motivations, so that when you get through, you will be a twisted human being, and therefore you will introject that kind of value upon the population as a whole. So this is why we have the paradox of the educated European not becoming civilized, but more uncivilized, and how ultimately knowledge will become the source of man's destruction. One of the fundamental orientations then of an Afrocentric education is to change this orientation, this fundamental death and rapacious motivation at the root of education. And one of the ways of doing this, of course, is to reintroject the spirit, the ethics, and to reintroject in some way religion and reverence for life in education. People who are educated without spirit, without a reverence for life, are educated to become prostitutes. They then will sell their services to the highest bidders, regardless of how what they will do will be used. And so we have the stupid situation that we are faced with today, where by offering a physicist a corner house and a two-car garage, and a full professorship, he will make a bomb that will destroy himself, his children and grandchildren, and the whole of the world. When we are blown up one day, we would recognize the superiority of those societies we've been trained to look down upon today. So consequently then, the African education is one that must be fundamentally redirected. Let's look again then at some of the differences, and I will wrap it up shortly. I don't think we gain a great deal if we are narrow in looking at African education and Egyptian education. If we assume that all we have to do is just reimpose it upon ourselves, because we have to face a reality. We do live in a different historical time and a different political, social, contextual time, and that, of course, has to be considered when we look at education. We have to recognize that the Egyptian was educated within a nation, within an empire. And of course, it means then that even when the Egyptian was educated in a very practical sense of saying, okay, you get educated this way and you will become a scribe and you will become respected by men and so forth and so on, you will make big money and this and so forth. You have to recognize that we can't quite motivate our own children in this light. You see, the most practical motivation in education is this: go to school so you can get a job. Go to school so you can be employed and gain status and so forth. But you must recognize when you own your own nation, this is compatible with advancing the interests of that nation. But when you are in the midst of another nation, and when you are a dominated people, to advise and motivate your children on that basis means that they have a narrow concept of education, and in following through their professions, they will support directly and indirectly the very system which dominates them. So we have to recognize, ladies and gentlemen, that it is not enough just to educate our children in reading, writing, and arithmetic. And I think even those of us who call ourselves Afrocentric have forgotten about that. We think that it is enough merely to train our children in Afrocentric thoughts and orientations. However, to train them in Afrocentric thoughts and orientation in mathematics and science without also preparing a nation for them is filled with problems. And often it means then that you will educate maybe a very brilliant mathematician who has Afrocentric ideas, but who in the end still must work for IBM and AT&T and the rest. And he'll find himself frustrated and upset, but in order to earn his bread, he's got to work for the enemy. So consequently then, a part of education, ladies and gentlemen, is the building of a nation and the building of institutions so that we can hire those ones we educate. So that in working to fulfill their own needs and desires, even though those needs may be somewhat selfish, they are still working to advance the interests of the nation. You can educate your children into scientific thinking and mathematical thinking all you wish. Unless you have an economy, it will come to nothing. Because today, ladies and gentlemen, doing an advanced project research project in physics costs millions and millions of dollars. If you're going to build a cyclotron, for instance, you may have to build that cyclotron filled with heavy magnets and heavy uses of electricity for 5 or 6 or 12 miles around. This requires tremendous investments of money and time. Consequently, it means if the African society is to advance to any great degree, the African society must develop its economy so that it can support scientific and other forms of research. Otherwise, we are just sort of making pipe dreams. We must recognize, too, that the Egyptian is being educated under the influence of autonomy. That is, Egypt is an autonomous nation and an empire. We must recognize today, though, that our education takes place under domination. And this, I think, means a fundamental difference in direction of education of the current African as against the Egyptian. To a good extent, a great deal of Egyptian education was conservative, maintaining a great and glorious nation and history and past, as well, of course, as maintaining their survival. But in our situation, ladies and gentlemen, we are not dealing in an autonomous context. We are operating in a context of domination, which means I think that our fundamental thrust, or at least the fundamental thrust of African education today, should be revolutionary. It should be an education geared toward the overthrow of those people who dominate us. While it will contain certain conservative elements, and it will seek to conserve those things in African history and in the African experience that are dear to us and that are important to us and that are at the very center of our personality and culture. And while it must also rebuild a culture, it must rebuild a tradition and build new traditions as well. The ultimate thing then is that our education has to be one that doesn't just close our mind into tradition, but one that opens our minds up, builds in a flexibility so that we can deal with the wily and clever enemies that we have before us today. So consequently then, the education of the African American is one that must be very closely tied to African tradition, but also to the current African reality and to the African future that we wish to make. We must recognize, too, that African education today has to be, to a large part, therapeutic. The African mind has been made ill by its experience with the European. It is sick, and it is near the point of madness, and it has to be restored. The African mind today, and I'm speaking of the world over, to a great extent is a mind still dominated by the servant mentality. We don't have time to go into the ramifications of that mentality, except that it is a mentality that is designed to maintain us in servitude and designed not to ensure our survival in the future. One of the things that you must recognize very clearly is that in order for oppression to work as it does today, we have to literally be robbed of our brain and of the use of our brain power. One of the major things that we have to be robbed of is our ability to think, and to think critically. I hold that ability above almost all the others. In fact, to create almost a sacrilege, I hold it as high as the knowledge of Afrocentric history. Because to me, a people who have a free mind and a critical mind will, by their very use of logic, come to know the value of being Afrocentric. We don't want our people to learn to be Afrocentric by the way of jingoisms and by the way of tight traditions. We want them to arrive at their Afrocentrism through the use of their free and great African minds. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to say that Professor Wilson is a community person who lives and functions in an institute part of his design in addition to hostess, and that he's very much a part of us. And what he has been saying to you this morning is the same thing he's been saying to us in the community weekly and sometimes daily all along. I want to deal very briefly with what Professor Richard said, then Professor Wilson, then we're going to go to questions, and we're not going to have that much time. Then we will vacate for the next panel. Professor Richard dealt principally with custom and culture and attitudes that grow out of custom and culture. And what we have lost in the Western world, we have lost the means of custom and culture. And let me show you what I mean. Now, we maintain through memory so much that was African in us. And I had to go to Africa to understand this. There was a custom in the South after a death that the family, someone comes from the community, and the ladies help to take everything out of the house and clean the house. That custom was consistent, even to the point where there was a stale old joke when someone comes into a house that's in disarray. They said, why don't somebody die in this house so the community can come and clean it up? All right, no. When I went to Africa, now when I went to Africa, I saw the other part of that way, the part that we had forgotten. I saw when the deceased, the widow of the deceased, begins to cry, and she never cries until the official announcement is made of her husband's death, no matter how much he feels, until the elder of the family have announced the death, he is not officially dead, although she knows physically he's dead. He's dead to the group when the elder says he's dead and announce that our brother has departed. And every time she wept, women of her age group came around her and they comfort her. That throughout that society there was someone to comfort you at every level. And when we danced out, and I say we because I got into the dance, out the life of the deceased, everybody there had to dance out his relationship to the deceased. And when it came almost my time to dance, I almost panicked. I'd never done a dance in an African ring in my life. And I asked an African girl, how do you do this dance? Where do you put your feet? And she looked me straight in the eye and said, Mr. Clarke, you have no feet. The African dance has nothing to do with the feet. It has to do with the soul. If you can feel your relationship with this man, then you can dance out that relationship. If it touches your heart, what you call your feet will take care of itself. Once I could understand how I related to the deceased, the morning meetings we had, he was a bus driver, how he always brought his son to the morning meetings to hear me speak English, didn't know that my English is less than perfect. And how we saw him to the door of the family compound as he went to in town to drive the buses. and how we read the evening papers and the morning papers together and discussed the affairs of the world. Once I knew and felt my relationship to the deceased, I got in the dance ring and did something well I'd never done in my life. I danced exceptionally well. Now, the important thing is that once the widow comes back, there's a ceremony when the whole community gives her the assurance that the community is going to take care of her. And when the men give her new shoes and they're singing, as long as there's shoes among your people, you'll have shoes. The women have disposed of all the clothes she wore when her husband was alive. In symbol of the new life, the women have made her a new wardrobe. And the women are singing, as long as there's clothes among your people, you'll have clothes. Then they make a big banquet. And she is to taste all of the food before anyone else eats. While they're singing, as long as there's food among your people, you'll have food. Then I said, these are the people here in the slums of Accra, in Ghana, who's supposed to be primitive. This is civilization. This is social security built into a culture. This is high culture. And this is what I mean by the preservation of custom in culture. And this is the first thing the European tries to take away from you. He laughs at your gods. Then he teaches you to laugh at your gods. Then he does not have to build massive prisoners, because once you laugh at your gods and turn your back on the culture that produced you, you are a prisoner, you are a slave. So education must be an education for restorations. Both Professor Wilson and Professor Richard dealt with symbols. And so long as we are not in control of symbols, it was the search for symbols that led me into the field of history, looking in the Sunday school lesson and not finding my people at all. Even in Africa, I couldn't find them. I see people going to the land of Punt, that's present day Somaliland, and they got white. I see an African named Moses going down to Ethiopia where he married Zipporah. Zipporah got white and he got white. The Bible gives him one Ethiopian wife. My research gives him 3. Let us say that he developed a taste for chocolate very early. But once you understand the nature of symbols and what it's supposed to do with your mind, once you begin to deal with the education and the restoration of images of yourself, then you're on your way. Then you will have to deal with the prevailing symbol. You will have to get rid of the blonde, blue-eyed Jesus in your churches. Until you do that, you will not give the Father the proper respect. And you will not know what we were doing at different parts, at different times in our history. Now, if you look at the time span of the color purple and look at the true history of black people, we were doing a whole lot of things. We were moving out of the South. We were resettling the whole march from Kansas. And once the Kansas River overflowed and Kansas got too bad, they marched out of Kansas and someone walked into Oklahoma. It was a period of Pap Singleton and his group. It was a period of early Pan-Africanism. We're doing a whole lot of things other than, and there may have been someone engaged in incest, but remember, throughout our total history, incest has been an act punishable by death. And two of the best-known novels written by blacks, Invisible Man begins with incest, and The Color Purple begins with incest. Because they are programmed by someone else to pick out images within whites and fasten them on us. Until you would deal with images and symbols, you won't deal with yourself. And you can begin with a mirror, and until you walk away from that mirror and say, I like what I see, you will not start to deal with images. Professor Jeffries has an announcement. Then we'll go into the questions.
Hotep, brothers and sisters. Certainly a beautiful thing to see all of you here at this institution. This is one of those institutions that Professor Wilson was talking about. If you have a degree from one of these institutions, like Columbia University and the rest, you're in trouble. And if you're teaching there, you're in trouble. A whole lot of things. We'll go into that as we get into the conference. We do want to go into some bookkeeping and other things that we have to make sure we take care of, and mechanics. I don't want to lose the flow of the panel. We will finish this panel and move right into the next panel with a short break in between. Then we will have a break for dinner. There are restaurants in the neighborhood that are available. There will be food vendors that are available. We wish you to come back in the, not straight too far. They have Reliables, Copelands, Wilsons within easy distance. Come back for the presidential address and also the activities after that in which Professor Clarke will be featured. So that gear yourself in terms of your time because this is a special happening and a special occasion. Yeah. Okay. We will have other announcements about the bus leaving, going back to the Penta, so people can prepare to come back this evening. We'll make those announcements later. A couple of our panelists were not able to attend because of health and other reasons. But I'm sure that we all had a fantastic presentation with the brothers and sisters that we have today. Could we give them a special round of applause? We've described the question and answer period as the African community response. So we expect to hear from you. John.
I don't have to repeat Dr. Ben's instructions about a question supposed to be a question and not a dissertation. Someone down there will have to recognize the hands for me because in this glare, I may not be able to see the hands very well. Let's come straight to the questions, make them short and right. And let's start right now. And we have approximately 10 minutes, maybe a little less, from we have to vacate for the next panel and the brief break before the new panel. Professor Wilson, you can address your question to Professor Wilson or myself, because the panel consists of practically two right now, except Professor Jeffries, who's administratively moving around, taking care of business. Yes.
You and Dr. Clarke, in fact, the entire panel dealt with symbols, and you particularly dealt with the child in reference to symbols. I want to ask you a question in reference to current trends or the type of programming that children are seeing and also reading. Comic books, what they see on television, Transformers, Voltron, Well, I won't ask what the symbols are. It's obvious what they are. But what is the effect of those symbols? Can you speak to that?
Okay. Generally, we have to note that all the institutions of the society, regardless of their nature, are dedicated to one major end, and that is maintaining the dominance of the Eurocentric society. And of course, the media is one of the major institutions. So there's good reason for us to expect it to function or perform in any way different from the others. As a matter of fact, the media are a central institution for the creation of the Afrocentric personality. It is a major means, as I mentioned earlier, by which you begin to brainwash people, and that is by controlling information and the nature of information and the interpretation of that information. And so it is obvious that the information that we see in the media, whether it's cartoons, soap operas, or what have you, ultimately are going to be presented in such a way as to maintain the status quo, that is, the power relationship between our people. It becomes very interesting to note that how many a scientist today relates his scientific interest and development to the reading of comic books. Of course, I've on other occasions urged that the Black community develops a science fiction, so-called a science fiction genre as a form of writing, because it is very, very important. The science fiction of today becomes the reality of tomorrow. The science fiction that stimulates the fantasies today becomes, of course, the science concrete existence, the concrete reality of tomorrow. When you look at these comic books and these other things and do not see yourself, obviously then the fantasies are not being stimulated, the imagination is not being stimulated, and in a sense, as the statement goes, what we cannot conceive, we really cannot produce, we cannot create. If we do not dream of ourselves as being masters of the universe, then that will not come as a reality to us. And these dreams begin in cartoons and fairy tales and in other materials that are fed to children. It's interesting to note when you look at cartoons, for instance, Masters of the Universe, of course the very name itself, Masters, and it suggests itself. And then there's the association of the masters with the white skin, or the masters with machinery, the transformers with machinery. Hero, of course, being a white man, Shira being a white woman, and so forth. So you get this constant association of mastery with whiteness. You also, and even though you get an association between good and bad, generally those people who are going to master the world, whether good or bad, are whites in one way or the others. Of course, the black characters, if they're included at all, are included as secondary characters and achieve their power through the delegation of their power from their white masters. It's often interesting to note that even when you have so-called cartoons that include black characters, they are quite often jokes. I think they have one Plastic Man. You see the spaceship with the big lips, and it's just a ridiculous type of thing, because even though it's so-called a space show, it's quite obvious that it's a joke immediately. Running throughout these cartoons on Saturday mornings is the theme of power. And so consequently, and of course running throughout comic books, is the theme of power. And the whole struggle is usually over who is going to rule the world, the bad guys or the good guys. But whether they're good or bad, they both are struggling for power. So by the time our children get through reading these comics and looking at these cartoons and looking at the various other things that occur on TV, their mentality has been one that is fitted for servitude. Next question, please.
For the next question, if you can hear me, for the next question, look at the symbol on TV. Why is the black character in different strokes a rump, and why is the one in Webster a rump? They never wish to show you full grown or full blown. And this is something else we have to fully deal with. All right, next question, please.
It's about from the local region. Question directed to Henrik. You mentioned critical thinking in the commented of the presentation, and how essential it would be for us to reconstruct this African view of things and also the whole duration. Now, I know you're doing some work in the area of black community psychology, and could you please just give us some input in terms of that particular thinking into projecting something for us?
Okay. As I indicated earlier, and of course, Freire talks about this as well, but I think any time you really looked very closely at the psychology of domination, you see that one of the major things it must remove is the ability to think critically and analytically, to the kind of thinking that weighs and measures and evaluates and relates and organizes and so forth. The major function of the servant, and that is the function, as far as the European is concerned, of our people, that is that of service to their own interests. It really doesn't matter how so-called well educated we become, how long we stay in school. The central plan of the European is that we perform a service in terms of their interest. So ultimately, our education, no matter what its length, is ultimately an education towards servitism. Essentially, the function of the servant then is not how to think, but what to think. His function essentially is one of carrying out orders. And therefore, the kind of mentality he should best develop is one that depends to a great deal upon memory and rote kinds of learning. It is a kind of mentality that is built to remember and learn in terms of expediency in order to carry out a particular function and thereafter to forget the order. And we see that often in the way many of our people learn today. We learn for credits, we learn to qualify for a job, we learn to sort of prepare to get a particular position, but often the learning has little intrinsic value or it gives us little intrinsic pleasure. Often I have to upbraid my students about the way they even read text. Literally, they focus right on the sentence that they're reading without connecting it to the sentence they read before, and without anticipating the sentence to come, without also holding in the back of their minds the framework in which the sentence they're reading is occurring, and in a sense relating on various levels what they're reading with past, present, and future experiences and events. Essentially, the sentence is read with a kind of mentality that focuses upon the immediate present and upon carrying out the activities of the immediate present. So consequently, even the education sometimes of people who we respect as being highly educated is the education of a parrot. Literally the education of where they are repeating what they have been told to repeat, where they literally then are echoing their teachers and have come to value what they're saying merely because their teachers have told them that it is valuable. In order for us to be transformed as a people, to be made into a subordinate group of people, the first thing that has to be removed from us is our capacity to think critically, which involves asking questions, which involves what we call in psychology reality testing, that is checking what is being stated against reality, evaluating it, looking at its logical consequences and conclusions. You must be put in a state of mind where you accept what is said on the basis of authority, on the basis of the authority of the speaker. So then the paternalistic relationship, which adheres in colonialistic organization, the paternalistic relationship that was present on the plantation, the paternalistic relationship that is present today in the world is the relationship that creates the white man as the authority, as the arbiter of truth, as the source of knowledge, and consequently then it reduces our ability to critically look at what he has to say. We accept what he has to say on his authority without thought, and we act upon it, and of course we act upon it in his interest. The world in no way, and this includes not only the black world, but also the white world, in no way could be the way it is if even 20% of the people in it could think critically. It is dependent on lies and on the belief of those lies, even lies like private property. The concept of private property, which we won't go into today, but a very interesting kind of lie. The lower class, in believing the upper class, supports that upper class because they are robbed of their critical skills. I'll end it here, even though I could talk quite a bit about this.
Look, thanks.
I'll stop here.
Our time is about running out. We're going to take two more questions, and we are obliged to stop. I would like to talk all evening, the same as you, and I would like to listen too. Yes, ma'am. Speak a little louder, please.
I'm wondering, revolutionary what? Information state, separate state, or minority posture?
Well, of course, I want you to write a prescription for the revolution. Okay? Of course, because one part about revolution is that revolution and the goal of revolution should be something, as Ferris says too, that is derived from dialogue, from the people dialoguing with each other, from an analysis of reality, an analysis of our situation, and then working that through. And one of the things he notes, which I subscribe to, is that we have to be very careful, those of us who are in so-called positions of leadership or influence, or whatever you want to call it, in the way we relate to our people, in that we don't want to come with them with prescriptions already laid out, because in a sense, through this kind of approach, we tend to bring on the kind of approach that already exists as a part of the master-slave relationship. And of course, by using this approach, we have to maintain the passivity of the people. And if we're talking about then critical thinking, the people themselves must be critically involved in determining the goals of revolution. So the thing that I'm getting at then is this, that the revolution and the goals of the revolution will be whatever African people, after an objective, Afrocentric determination and cultural analysis, will determine that they will be.
Realistically, that takes decades on. I'm a mother. I have a child. What do I teach my child right now in terms of this goal?
The major thing, I think, in terms of the immediate situation, is to strive for, as I've urged earlier, the teaching of that child of course, to perceive the world clearly and realistically, and to give it the abilities and the skills by which it can perform a realistic analysis of that world, and orient it toward basing its activities and behavior on reality itself, which of course then involves what we call these cognitive skills training, the reasoning skills training, the very basic ones, of course the use of the word itself, sharpening its observational abilities and its abilities to project in terms of planning and organizing, and its ability to see relations between causes and effects. And of course, in relationship to that, a history and a knowledge of itself, its people, and its culture. And I think with this basic arming of the child, it will then, of course, arrive at the kinds of behaviors and knowledge that will secure its survival and its coping in the current world today.
I'd like to say that because we misunderstand the word revolution, we even think the American Revolution was a revolution, and it was not. We think the French Revolution was a revolution, and it was not. We've got to first understand what a revolution means. It means complete change. And we cannot have a revolution imitating other people. The Africans, when in charge of their own destiny, had many revolutions. He sat down and realized that certain aspects of the society had grown obsolete and had to be changed. And he intelligently changed it, and he changed most of them without drawing a drop of blood. The European has never been as peaceful and as intelligent enough to make great social changes without declaring war on other people. We cannot have revolution imitating the European because he is not revolutionary. We'll have the last question, and I purposely tried to avoid mentioning cause something or another, because you have two kinds of Marxists among blacks. You have the Groucho Marxists and the Karl Marxists. And I'm always running into the Grouchos, and I'm trying to avoid that today. We'll take the last question, please. Yes, sir.
Psychogenic brain damage? Yes, the simple idea is that you can accomplish through the use of the word, as we mentioned, through conditioning, through oppression and the other kinds of things we are very familiar with as people, the same results in creating a mental state and behavior as you would through the deliberate physical destruction of the brain itself. In other words, we can disorganize the brain physically through the use of drugs, through, of course, through excising with the surgical knife, through various other physical means, and of course you can create various behaviors and wipe out various abilities through this physical means. What we're indicating and what must be made clear is that the same kinds of things you accomplish through physical means can be accomplished through psychological means as well. For instance, you can control intractable pain, or you can control some forms, at least it has been tried anyway, to control some forms of schizophrenia and schizophrenic behavior and other forms of behavior by performing what we call lobotomy. Lobotomy, that is the cutting off of the frontal lobes from the other part of the brain. One of the problems with that, besides the fact that the operation often does not work that very well, is the fact that there are other side effects, such as reduced motivation on the part of the patient, such as easy distractibility on the part of the patient, such as the inability to maintain attention, the inability to achieve certain goals, a certain lack of appropriate emotional response on the part of the patient. It's also interesting to note that the frontal lobes are that aspect of the brain that uses the word, that uses images to organize the rest of the brain and to actually program the body to achieve certain goals. So when a command is given to the frontal lobes translate that command into body behavior, into attentional behavior, into setting goals, into testing behavior, so that once the goal is set, the frontal lobe programs the eyes and the senses to be sensitive to various things that are necessary to the accomplishing of that goal, calling up previous information and correlating as such. It maintains focus so that things that are irrelevant to the achievement of the goal are not attended to. And all of this is accomplished by the use of words and symbols and experience in the frontal lobes. So consequently then, people without words, without certain symbols, without certain experiences, or with certain words and experiences, you see, and when those symbols, those experiences are used by the brain, are made capable or incapable of certain forms of behavior. So to deny certain people words, concepts, and images, and experiences, to introject into those frontal lobes senses of inferiority, lack of self-confidence, self-hatred, and other kinds of things, is to literally then to perform a lobotomy on the individual. So consequently, you will find many of our people, as a result of this psychological lobotomy, having the symptoms of a psychosurgical patient. The inability to maintain goals and senses of direction, the inability to determine what is relevant from the irrelevant, the inability to correlate necessary information to achievement of a goal, the inability to completely program the body and behavior in line with the goal, the inability to check against reality the behavior and see if it is behavior that is accomplishing the end sought by the person. Of course, then the rewriting of history by the European, the scandalization of the African personality, the introduction into the African of self-doubt about his abilities, the whole system of paternalism, which takes away from the African the responsibility for his future, is a part of this psychological psychosurgery. And it is then a way of robbing the African brain of its necessary programs to achieve African survival and independence. It is a way then of literally cutting up our brains without physically entering into our skulls. Thank you very much.
Thank you, brothers and sisters. There'll be a short break before the next question, very short, I think, because we've used up more than enough of our time. All right, prepare to come right back for another panel and partake of these fruits of education. Thank you very much again.
Appropriate that I be asked to chair the very last panel because I live so far away in Seattle, Washington. And, and we decided on this particular panel not to hurry. We prepared for this panel, which we feel is so significant, speaking about the African family, the Nile, and we have some very, very, very important messages to share with you. I would like to introduce the members of the panel. Sister Clarke, who many of us have shared a number of experiences with for the last 3 years in Los Angeles and in Chicago, and Sister Gordon, and Sister Jeannie Bain. I'm asking us, if we feel that we are going to get a little restless and need to catch buses and things, if we would do it very respectfully. Thank you. And we'll start off with Sister Clarke.
Hotep. Sister Mims and members of the panel, brothers and sisters, I'd like to talk with you on the traditional African family as foundation of the African worldview and African development. And the purpose of this paper will be, one, describe how the traditional African family function as foundation of our ancestors' worldview and of African development. And second, the theological or ontological authority by which the African family was formed and developed. Third, using the traditional African family as a paradigm, discuss how we African Americans can reconstitute and reconstruct our families as the sine qua non foundation for liberating and developing our communities at the local and national levels. When we speak of the African family, we are talking about essential characteristics of a social unit which nurtured and sustained its members as a unified group. The traditional extended kinship family included intergenerational family units, parents, grand and great-grandparents, and their children and children's children. The next larger family unit consisted of several extended families called clans. These clans claimed a common ancestor. Thus, the clans provided historical continuity and a strong sense of identity for all family members. Several clans formed a nation, and when several nations came together, they formed kingdoms or empires depending on the circumstances. Another essential characteristic of the extended family was the practice of self-reliance, which enabled each family to be self-sufficient. This was evidenced by the fact that each family was responsible for producing its basic needs, food, housing, clothing, from the land. A family acquired products and services which it lacked through the medium of trade and exchange. Networking of families in the production and distribution of goods and services enabled families to exert powerful influence in the economic, social, and political life of the nation. Thus, in periods of national crisis, a self-evident, commonplace expression reminded the nation's leaders, quote, that the ruin of a nation begins in its homes. On the other hand, when all was well and peace and prosperity covered the land, the converse expression was applicable. The strength of a nation begins in its homes. Important to the inner stability of the African family was the African woman as mother and as her children's first teacher. She was an equal economic partner to her husband in that she helped provide food for her family, nurtured the family through preparing its meals. She was solicitous of the physical and emotional needs of her husband and children, and she was attentive to their health care. The traditional African family was matrifocal, that is, the wife and mother was the central focus of the family. Just as the African mother was responsible for teaching right, ethical, and moral behavior to her children, the African mother was the main link between two families. For when a man and woman married, it marked the uniting of two families rather than the mere coming together or union of two people in marriage. For it was expected that the wife would bear children, assuring the perpetuity of both families. The wife was a conduit also for inheritance, which passed through her to her brother's sons. Her brother in return protected his sister, and in the event of her husband's death, her brother provided for his sister's children. The brother protected his sister from abuse unless she committed adultery or some other horrible infraction of the society's rules. An African man could not abuse his wife. As we have seen, the African woman was held in high esteem. She was independent, could come and go without asking anyone's permission, because the African woman safeguarded her independence by exercising her unerring sense of personal responsibility for her actions. It is quite apparent that the inherent organizational structure and function of the African family made the family the nation's most valued human resource and institution. In addition, undergirding the family and strengthening the family's unity was the practice of circumcision and excision. Upon reaching puberty, boys and girls were grouped separately in training camps away from their villages, where they underwent rigorous training and tests in preparation for ritual initiation, marking the death of their childhood. Those young people who passed these tests were resurrected, as it were, into their communities as men and women ready to enter into their new cycle as responsible adults, ready to assume their future responsibilities of marriage and parenting. Nothing was left to chance during the several months of rigorous training. In the case of the young girls, they were taught how to perform household chores, gardening skills, and especially how to prepare nutritious meals for their future husbands and children. They were taught how to respond to their husbands' physical and emotional needs, how to enhance their own feminine charms and graces as a means of heightening their self-image, which fosters self-confidence in a woman, especially when the knowledge of wifing is being transmitted by women who have been there. Instructions were given on when and where to make love, have sexual intercourse, what positions were permissible and which were not sanctioned by tradition. Boys were taught basic survival skills befitting a man. Here too, boys' self-image and manliness was assured through trial by ordeal, testing their skills in calculations, hunting, learning their duties to their future wives and children as protectors and supporters, providers. They learned how to defend their communities and or nations when necessary. The young people's rebirth was celebrated by the community, symbolizing that these young adults were released from their childhood cycle of depending on their biological parents for nurturing. They were reborn as productive children of the community, ready to help shape the destinies of their communities and nations. Thus we see how age grouping cuts across all biological family ties, creating strong political and social bonding between men and women of each age group, so strong that these age groups were prone to feel and act like brothers and sisters in response to their group interests and group needs. We may ask how Africans throughout the continent concurred on the idea of structuring a matrilinear family system which embraced the practice of circumcision and excision. Who was their source of authority? What were their basic assumptions? The late Cheikh Anta Diop provides a clue when he stated, "The matriarchal system proper is characterized by the collaboration and harmonious flowering of both sexes and by a certain preeminence of women in society due originally to economic conditions, but accepted and even defended by man." To say that men and women agreed on setting up a matrifocal family organization is true, but we need to search deeper for a bottom-line response. Diop states that our Egyptian ancestors started with the concrete material conditions of their environment and then moved back in time to abstract an ontological or theological basis of authority for sanctions governing man's relationship to God and behavioral relationships between people and the relationship of man to nature. Diop says further that because the requirements of agricultural life, concepts such as matriarchy and totemism, the most perfect social organization, and monotheistic religion were born. He says further in describing the nature of monotheism, circumcision resulted from monotheism. It was really the notion of a God, Amun, uncreated of all that exists, and that led to the androgynous concept. Since Amun was not created, and since he is the origin of all creation, there was a time when Amun was alone. He must have contained within himself all male and female principles necessary for procreation. Belief in this hermaphroditic ontology would produce circumcision and excision in the black world, end of quote. So we see it was no accident that our forebears built our societal constructs on family relationships wherein the complementary equality between man and woman was acknowledged to be inherent in the very nature of creation and creativity. Hence, equality of man and woman was created by God or ordained by God, Amun. There is only one creator God, Amun. Amun is both male and female. Therefore, circumcision of the male prepuce, excision of the female clitoris is sanctioned by our ancestors' perception of the androgynous nature of the one and only creator God. Using the human family as microcosm, the Egyptians intuited that Amun-Ra created a celestial family of gods and goddesses, both male and female, and endowed each with her respective characteristics and functions in nature. The function of the gods and goddesses have been described in great detail by scribes in Egyptian mythology. We know that this ontological basis for legitimizing the structure of the African family spread throughout all black Africa, starting with the material requirements of the natural environment, and as Diop contends, one could go on to explain all the traits of the Negro soul and civilization by using the material conditions of the Nile Valley as a point of departure. The belief that God Amun-Ra is both male and female translates into word, or the principle of creativity. There was a void, and then God spoke, and creation process began. Africans such as the Dogons of West Africa never relinquished their perception of God as androgynous being. On this basis, there can be no plant life, no biological life, or material phenomenon without a union of male-female essences. Even energies which are not seen by the naked eye, such as electricity, require the harmonious flow of negative electrons with positive protons. When we plug a lamp for light or an iron for heating, a male plug has to be hooked into a female socket. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, by contrast, God is perceived as male only, giving rise in part to the patriarchal family structure. This view of a creator deity gives rise to irreconcilable dichotomies. It has taken the rise of speculative scientific skepticism in Western culture to resolve the dichotomy which characterizes Western myopic vision. East is east, and west is west, and ne'er the twain shall meet. While Egyptians used word to identify the beginning creation, they posited an all-encompassing universal ethical religious principle which celebrates man's ascendancy to civilization and self-awareness. This principle, Mayat, means truth, righteousness, and justice. Truth, righteousness, and justice were with God, Amun, before anything was created. Mayat was in place before creation. The Egyptian tradition does not lend itself to an Adam and Eve myth, because in Egyptian mythology, our African forebears posited the concept of Mayat with full knowledge of plant reproduction, animal and human sexuality. Mayat appeals to our spiritual nature by requiring us to respect our sacrosanct and divine urge to recreate our own images generation after generation until the end of time. Mayat is an all-encompassing principle of governance upon which our Egyptian ancestors predicated all of their institutions, economic, social, political, with family as the primary institution. In the instruction of Ta-Hotep, as translated in the Hosea, we are told, strive for excellence in all you do, so that no fault can be found in your character. For Mayat, the way of truth, justice, and righteousness is great. Its value is lasting, and it has remained unequaled and unchanged since the time of its creator. Although wickedness may gain wealth, wrongdoing has never brought its wares to a safe port. In the end, it is Mayat, the way of truth, justice, and righteousness that endures and enables the upright to say, it is the legacy of my father and mother. Early symptoms of the breakdown of order and balance, that is Mayat, in the collective life of a people occurs in the nation's homes. When Egypt underwent a severe social crisis in the first intermediary period, Impur complained, as recorded in the Hosea, "Lo, what the ancestors foretold has come to pass. The land is full of bandits and evildoers, and the plowman goes to plow with his shield. Lo, the land turns like a potter's wheel. The robbers have become rich, and the honorable person a thief. The foreigners from without have come to Egypt and the Egyptian of yesterday cannot be found anywhere. The great and small say, "I wish I were dead." And little children say, "He should not have caused me to live." And the unrestrained say, "If I knew where God is, I would serve him." Today, following close on the heels of white America, the African-American family is in just such a crisis as described in the book of Impur. Our men and women are becoming strangers to each other. Too many of our children are begetting children without any prior knowledge or understanding of the responsibilities incumbent upon them in homemaking and parenting. They are further hampered by the fact that neither the boy nor girl have finished high school or acquired marketable skills. The generational pattern of children raising themselves in the street give us pause, for our future is dimmed by our increasing numbers of youth who are dispirited and frustrated with no hope. However, it is in times of crisis that we have our greatest opportunity to turn our conditions around. When people despair to the point where they cry out in anguish, "If I knew where God is, I would serve him." In all of our beginnings, whether in West Africa, Central, South, or East Africa, our ancestors examined and used the material conditions of their environment as the basis for building institutions beginning with the family. To rescue and reconstruct our African-American family demands of us return to our African work ethic, namely, organize our human resources in such a manner that we work consciously for ourselves as an African community. Take, for example, the economic factor. If immigrants can come here from Europe, Middle East, and Asia, set up businesses in our neighborhoods, and profits out of our neighborhoods to invest in their communities, why can we not keep the profits in our neighborhoods by supporting businesses owned by individual African entrepreneurs and businesses owned by our people collectively in the form of cooperatives? Such a turnaround would provide the means to train and employ a number of our youth whose survival is dependent solely upon their street smarts. Sisters and brothers, we must re-examine our individual and collective lives through continuous study of our beginnings and implement the lessons we learned from our beginnings, starting with the first beginning, namely creation. We have learned from our readings, lectures, and discussions that the first and greatest civilization known to man was built by our Egyptian ancestors. Our studies further inform us that the creation principle, or the principle of creativity as intuited by our Egyptian ancestors, became the cornerstone upon which the first and greatest civilization known to man was founded. This universal principle, youth, truth, righteousness, justice, has withstood the test of time and will last throughout eternity. Therefore, it behooves us to renew our faith by internalizing Mayat as we reach out to touch the lives of brothers and sisters who, in their striking out blindly and in darkness for answers, maim and short-circuit their own lives and the lives of us who are closest to them. In fact, we shall not rest, for only Amun-Ra was satisfied after creation of the universe of complementary forces harmonized by the divine law of Mayat. and he rested. Amun-Ra permits us to develop to the limits of our capabilities the ongoing creative building process within the sphere of human activity. The tremendous energies and smarts of our young must be challenged and channeled into creative purpose living. It is incumbent upon us to transmit to them the true knowledge about ourselves. Teach them that we are social bodies, social minds and spirits, two sides of the same coin, so to speak. Our awareness of our many levels of spirit depend upon the extent to which we explore our spiritual dimensions. It is through our minds and spirits that Mayat empowers us to harmonize and keep in balance our energies and achievements. Our young will come to know that where Mayat is, God is, and God is in us. The radical and rapid technological changes in our material circumstances, mass and jet transportation, satellite communications, nuclear energy, in no way dwarf our struggle for liberation of our minds and spirits. These material changes are the accumulative evolution of human effort and human intelligence. No single cultural group or ethnic group has a corner on human intelligence and energies. We laid the foundations for the development of Western civilization and technology. Using our collective human resources, we must rebuild humanizing institutions. Finally, at the height of the civil rights movement in 1966, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell rang a bell in his baccalaureate sermon at Howard University when he said, "Human rights are God-given. Civil rights are man-made. Our lives must be purposed to implement human rights. To demand these God-given rights is to seek black power, the power to build black institutions of splendid achievement." As we place our faith in Mayat as envisioned by our ancestors, we will again take our place center stage in world history by building and rebuilding even greater African institutions of splendid achievement, beginning with the African family.